Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my presentation about the opportunities and obstacles while exporting to North America and the Middle East. My name is Hans Laschefski, and I'm the Industry Marketing Manager for lighting for the region Europe, Middle East, and Africa. First of all, I would like to give you a little overview about our activities across the world just for lighting. As you can see on this slide here, these are the locations where we provide labs in order to test your products across the world. In Europe, we are located with the headquarters in Carugate, that is a place close to Milan, but we have a lab in addition to that in Frankfurt, and we have a strong relationship with the LIA, the Lighting Industry Association of the UK in Telford in the UK. We are known for issuing UL-based certificates. We are already #1 in the world in North America and Europe, as you can see in the right upper corner, when it comes to such certificates. But for a long time, we issue in addition to that, and that is very often not known, especially in Europe, IEC-based certificates. In North America, we are already the #1, in Europe, #3, and across the world, IEC-based just for lighting, #5. But let's talk a little bit about export. If it comes to export, what do you need to take into account? What is important when you try to sell your products in North America or somewhere in the Middle East region? From the Middle East region, I will concentrate a little bit on the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, because these are the main countries in the Middle East where the European lighting industry exports to. But let's start with the activities of the lighting industry, the European one, when it comes to exports. How does it look like? In general, the European lighting industry exported last year, so in 2019, about 13.2 billion euros across the world. The export is mainly, to be honest, from the European industry to European countries, because usually between 75, last year it was 79% of the export is done within Europe. But nevertheless, more than 20% last year, usually around 25%, is exported outside the European Union. And if you have a closer look at these 20%, you will realize 5% of it goes to the Middle East region, and the other 5% are dedicated to North America, so USA and Canada. 2% are exported to Russia, and another 2% approximately towards the Asia Pacific region. So Middle East and North Africa are the main export countries outside the European Union for the European lighting industry. Now let's have a closer look at North America. Important is when I talk to customers, they always tell me, hey, you need to have, and it is mandatory, a safety certificate for this region. To be honest, this is wrong. From a legal perspective, there is no mandatory safety certificate for this region required. But you will realize, talking to your customer, talking to installers in this area, they will ask you to show such a certificate. Usually they expect you to have such a certificate, even if it is not required by law. And that is different to Europe, there is no mandatory EMC testing or something like this for this region necessary. You know that the supply voltage is 110 volt, 120 for Canada, and therefore you need definitely multi-range drivers, or you need finally dedicated drivers for this area. So it might be a good idea to have a separate dedicated product portfolio to serve this area. But finally now expect when the customer is asking for a safety certificate that you need to have a national recognized testing lab that performs such a test. Who can do it? Is it just UL? No, that's not. Because these national recognized testing labs are accredited by the so-called OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. There is a list. You find the list on a web page, which I mentioned in the lower right corner. And you will get a long list of already accredited national recognized testing labs, which can issue the safety certificate, which is based on the UL 1598 for lighting products. And the big three currently in the market are CSA, ETL, and UL. Here you see a table which gives you an idea of the market share of these companies. But even these, I would say, dominate the market. There are additional labs being accredited in order to test lighting products like TÜV Süd, TÜV Rheinland, SGS, Bureau Veritas, and MET here in Europe, and some additional accredited labs in the US. If you compare these safety mark for North America with Europe, you will realize there is a big difference. Here in Europe, I would say the equivalent is ANAC. And usually the ANAC comes along with an additional number, like 15, this is UL. But this number is very, very neutral. And this is beneficial, at least for the clients for the companies, because one thing is very much clear: nobody knows the number. Yeah? So this is just showing that the product complies with the current standard and everything is fine. In North America, it's different. From the mark, you will easily recognize which company did the test. You will immediately know who performed the test and who is the one who is issuing finally the certificate. Because here the mark shows immediately the company which issued the certificate. The C in front of the mark indicates that the safety mark is dedicated to Canada. The US behind the logo shows immediately the information that the mark is appropriate for the US. At this point, I would like to compare a little bit the standards which you need to take into account while exporting to North America or somewhere in the IEC world. So as you can see, this slide here gives you an information which standards should be taken into account while certifying your products for these regions. In the IEC world, it's quite simple. You have the general requirements formulated in the 6598-1, and then usually there is a -2 and another dash that indicates the special type of luminaires. For example, for road and street lighting, it's -2, -3. You get the additional information within this standard. In the North American world, it's absolutely different because everything is covered by the UL 1598. And you should take into account that these standard differs tremendously from the IEC ones. So for example, if you have a closer look at horticultural luminaires, you will realize there is the UL 8800. There is no such equivalence on the IEC side, but the requirements formulated in the UL 8800 need to be taken into account. And this is something really you have to work on, because the design of the luminaires might differ really tremendously from the design which is appropriate here in Europe or somewhere else in the IEC world. So for example, recessed luminaires look totally different in the North American area compared to the IEC world. We very often realize that there is mentioned that a power unit in class 2 is required. Immediately in the IEC world, you would say, okay, this needs to be a self-driver or something like this. Please be aware that class 2 is defined in the North American world in a different way, because we have a differentiation between dry and lamp application and wet locations. And as you can see, this is finally self, but you have a limit in the wattage by 100 watt, and you have a limit for your voltage. And this needs to be taken into account if you design luminaires, because here a redesign of the European version is absolutely necessary. If we talk about performance aspects for this region, we are familiar here in Europe with an energy label. We are familiar with NAC+. Something like this does not exist in North America. What is really beneficial, if you can prove your performance of the luminaire by registering it to the so-called qualified product list of the DLC. The DLC is the DesignLights Consortium. It's a not-for-profit organization, and they run this qualified product list on the web, and professional users have a look at it, and they check out which luminaires are in this QPL, and that is sometimes very beneficial because they decide to go for such products, because very often from an incentive perspective, such an DLC listing, special here the so-called DLC premium listing, is beneficial, because if you have it, you might get some, the final user might get some incentives in order to reduce the amount of energy that is needed in the US. So to meet these requirements is, from my perspective, not really difficult, because as you can see, they expect an efficiency of 85 to 130 lumen per watts, depending a little bit on the type of luminaires you are producing. And the UGR values are not so challenging, because as you can see, UGR 22 to 28, that is usually nothing we are afraid of. For horticultural lighting, there is a program 2 in the market, but they expect, for example, a driver and a fan lifetime of more than 50,000 hours and a 5 years warranty for the product in order to register these products in the qualified product list. So this is something that is beneficial too. And finally, there is now a new program regarding the lighting controls. And it's interesting to see that the DLC now formulates requirements regarding cybersecurity. So there is a first step regarding this topic of cybersecurity, at least in the North American market. Okay, now let's focus a little bit the Middle East. There was a very, very good idea formulated in the early 2010s by this region. They decided to go for the so-called G mark. G mark stands for Gulf Conformity Mark, and it was very, very fast developed for electrical fans, refrigerators, and so on. In the early stage, published in 2014, everybody expected that sooner or later, lamps, luminaires, and drivers will be added to this list. But unfortunately, till now, there is no such requirements for the G mark for drivers, lamps, and luminaires. So there is just the idea that this is beneficial, but it doesn't work because all the countries now started where their own ideas and own requirements. They formulated own programs in order to get requirements for lighting products. So let's first focus a little bit the United Arab Emirates. Important to know here is that there is a mandatory safety certificate. And due to the fact that the UAE is dedicated to the IEC world, they ask for a so-called CB test report. This is mandatory. You need to have it. There is no way around it. Yeah, this is important to know. But as mentioned, it's based on the IEC standards, and therefore you are familiar already with the requirements, because if you do an ANAC, this is nothing else. This is comparable. Important to know is if you go for such registration of your products for this area, you need to have the IEC CB test report. You need to have additional information regarding performance and functionality, but at this point you can provide this information by in-house or internal test reports per model. But you need to have, in addition to that, a test report regarding hazard substances from an accredited lab. And this is definitely a third-party test at this point, which need to be fulfilled. You need to have a certification office in this area, finally, to register these products. And there are two options. There is the so-called ECAS, which I mentioned here on the left-hand side, and there is the Emirates Quality Mark. The big difference is, or the advantage of the Emirates Quality Mark is that you can add more models to such a certificate, and it is valid for 3 years, but you have to take into account the fact that there is an additional factory assessment which need to be performed if you go this way. And on the left-hand side, you have, I would say, the one-time use of an ECAS mark for your model, for your lighting product. While exporting to Saudi Arabia, it's a little bit different. Again, we have, and this is in common with the UAE market, the requirement of a mandatory safety certificate. Again, IEC based, so a CB test report and a CB test certificate is mandatory. It must not be older than 3 years. So you have to have this test report that is usually done by a third-party lab. But that's not all. Because if you go to Saudi Arabia, you will realize that there are 3 steps necessary, absolutely necessary. First of all, there is what you need to have is an energy label. So that is step 1. Step 2 is then that you get an IEC recognition certificate that is finally based on the CB test report. Sometimes there are some minor national deviations to be taken into account. And finally, while registering your products, you can get the so-called SASO shipment certificate. And with these documents, then you can export your products to Saudi Arabia. This looks a little bit complicated. It isn't, but it takes time. That needs to be taken into account, because if you go for the energy label, you will realize at the very beginning that the requirements are not so difficult to meet. Because for luminaires, for example, if the system power is below 15 watts, the minimum efficacy is only 65 lumen per watt. And if the system power is above 15 watts, the minimum efficacy is 70 lumen per watt. That is not really difficult to meet. But, and this is important at this point, you need to provide an information about endurance. So lamp survival factor, lumen maintenance, and so on. And this test, which is mandatory, needs to last for 2,000 hours in an accredited lab. So there is a tremendous time needed to perform such a test. 2,000 hours is close to 3 months. So if you really want to export, you should, I would recommend you should design a subset of your product portfolio, which you really like to certify for this region. And then you should start with such tests because it is time consuming. In addition, there is a little obstacle you should be aware that is mentioned in H1.2, because there is an additional requirement for the control gear for halogen and LED lamps. The efficiency of the control gear should be at least 0.91 at 100% load. This is not really tricky, but if you have luminaires with a very, very low wattage, then sometimes you run into problems. So have a first look, check whether your control gear meets these requirements, and then everything is fine. These are, I would say, the main obstacles when it comes to export to Saudi Arabia. The second step is mandatory since the 1st of February 2019. As mentioned already, you have to have a CB test report, which is not older but 3 years. It needs to be renewed 60 days ahead of expiring date. But I think this is nothing that is a real challenge. And finally, with all the information, you can initiate the process in order to get the so-called pre-shipment verification or the certificate of conformity from the SASO. And finally, you get then the market access to Saudi Arabia. Please remember again, first of all, and this is absolutely mandatory, you need to have at first the energy label. Then you can go for the SASO IECE recognition certificate, which is based on the CB test report. And then with these documents, finally, you get the access to Saudi Arabia after you registered your products. There is one aspect you should take into account if you intend to ship street lighting towards Saudi Arabia. There will be additional requirements starting from the 1st of September 2020, so in 4 weeks. I will just give you some very brief idea about it. In general, here the requirements are a little bit harder to fulfill because first of all, you have to have an efficacy of 120 lumen per watt. And the LED chips are tested and certified for more than 25 degrees. The efficiency should be above 140 lumen per watt. This is mandatory. You have to provide this information. So the Saudi Arabia is really expecting luminaires with a nice efficiency and efficacy, and this is important to mention. In addition to that, they ask for some in situ tests, and this goes in line for the LED chips, lenses, drivers, and the surge protection devices at a temperature of 50 degrees. That is important. So you can't run these tests at 25 degrees or something like this. It needs to be performed at 50 degrees. What is important here is they expect an L70 of 70% at 50,000 hours. The color temperature should be between 3,000 and 6,000 K. And the 5-step McAdam ellipse color consistency, I think, is not really an issue or difficult to fulfill. But these requirements are in addition for streetlights for Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, there are some additional electrical requirements. The installation should have an overvoltage protection of 10 volt. The control unit should be protected by at least 4 kilovolt. And constant voltage drivers are not allowed. This is important, you should realize. Drivers should be programmable. They prefer DALI, or it could be realized by 0 to 10 volt as a dimmable function for such drivers. Finally, and that is something you should really be aware of, they expect so-called multi-range drivers for the luminaires, because they have still some areas where 120 volt are present, and they do not accept anymore luminaires which only come with drivers for 230 volt. Nevertheless, and this is, I would say, not really a challenge, the power factor should be above 0.9. Additionally, and finally, they have some expectations regarding the IP rating of the products, IP66. They have an expectation regarding IKEA ratings. So at this point, IKEA 08. And the enclosure should be designed to withstand temperatures between -10 and 85 degrees. That is something from a design perspective you should take into account. Yeah, that's, I would say, all for now. Lesson learned. I like to sum up a little bit the main points which I already mentioned. For export to North America, from a legal perspective, a safety certificate is absolutely not mandatory. Most of the clients or installers expect such a safety certificate, even if it is not mandatory by law. And what we very often realize that the customer or the installer really prefers a specific test house to perform such tests. Expect main changes for your luminaire design, because the standards UL and IEC based differ a lot. That is really important to realize. Finally, if you think of exporting to the Middle East, and here I refer general, first of all, to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, CB test report and certificate is absolutely mandatory. You need to have it. There is no way around. And you should allow some time for administrative tasks. We have some specialties with Saudi Arabia. There is the performance label, which is mandatory. And due to the 2000-hour endurance test, you should expect that you at least allow this time to be performed. So there is a period of 3 months at least necessary if you start such tests. And please expect some new requirements for streetlights starting from September 2020. Most of the manufacturers I know define an export subset of their product portfolio in order to limit cost and effort. Because if you really like to certify your whole product range for your export activities, you might fail, because this is too, I would say, cost intensive and wouldn't meet finally commercial aspects of the projects. So I hope this was a nice overview, and if there are any questions left, there is always an opportunity to get into contact with us. My email address with ul.com is simple, because it's nothing else but hans.laschefski, but you can reach out for any additional advice, any additional ideas. by contacting us under appliancelighting.eu@ul.com, or you can visit definitely our website ul.com, and you will get additional information regarding the GMA services, what we call, that is global market access services, which we provide even if you do not expect or do not intend to export to North America or the Middle East. Wherever you go, we will support you while issuing the required certificates. Thanks a lot for your attention.